Hello, writers. Have you ever bought a writing craft book someone says you just have to read?
Is it still sitting on your shelf? Have you even cracked the spine?
That's totally me.
Don't ask Renee how many craft books she owns.
Why do we keep buying these books we never read?
We all want to improve as writers, but that's hard to do alone.
That's why we started the Words to Write By podcast, to tackle these books together chapter by chapter and learn from their advice.
Or not. Sometimes they're wrong.
Hi, I'm Renee Nelson, former college writing instructor turned full-time writer and podcaster. After many years, I finally have a complete draft of my memoir.
And I'm Kim Smuga-Otto, author of the humorous fantasy series Boy Bands and Dragons. The first book, Our Comeback Tour Slaying Monsters, will be released this year by Riverfolk Publishing.
And now, on with the podcast.
Hello and welcome to Words to Write By.
Hello, everybody.
This is a workshop episode. We have just finished going through all 12 steps of the hero's journey. And so we are going to have one last story structure kind of interview workshop with a romance writer.
Yes, and we're going to discuss climaxes.
Because that's what everyone wants to talk about with romance writers.
Wow. Good, Tim.
We have as our guest Lia Riley, and her latest book is called Puck Prejudice. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I have no idea what this book could possibly be about.
Well, I will say that this is a title. So, sometimes people are like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the title or the story? For me, the title came first. I was just in the shower one day and the title popped into my head. And I was like, that is a catchy title. I'm into it. I wonder what I could do with a book with that title. I'm a really avid K-drama watcher, Korean drama watcher. In Korean drama, a trope that is very common is time travel through water portal. I wouldn't say it's the most common, but it's not an unknown trope. And I'd been wanting to do some writing that was kind of just a little bit inspired by a lot of the show watching that I like to watch. That's really trope driven, and I like romance and how it's paced and plotted. And so I came up with an idea of doing Hockey Goes Back in Time, with one of the ideas being that in a traditional regency romance, I would say one of the perennial hero archetypes is a duke. And so dukes are very common. There are more fictional dukes than there ever were in real life. You just suspend disbelief and, you get with your duke. The hockey player is also very popular in romantic fiction right now. And I would almost say that it's kind of another archetypal like a duke. And so I had some fun thinking about what it would be like to take kind of what we would consider a modern aspirational, almost royalty-ish type person of a professional sports person, and then put them back in time. And so, yeah, that was kind of where the idea of Pride and Prejudice Puck and Prejudice came up. It's not a retelling of Puck and Prejudice, although Jane Austen does feature as a character, because you do a podcast. I have a podcast as well on Korean dramas. I like listening to podcasts, and one that I really like is called How Did This Get Made? And so I thought it would be fun to do kind of an imaginative retelling of what it would be like too, if you were in a position of somebody like Jane Austen, of what lived observations are you making that are going to put themselves in the book. So there's Easter eggs in the book from Pride and Prejudice of just kind of she's in the process of writing that book as the story's unfolding around her.
Neat.
So yes, it is a romance. It has definitely smut elements to it, which I get behind. And yeah, it was very challenging to write once I got into it because it has alternating POV chapters. And so I'm writing from the point of view of a contemporary hero and then a Regency heroine. And I started to think am I just going to make everyone unhappy, or will a historical reader be happy and a contemporary reader will not be? So that was kind of one of the muddles I got myself into. But that's the book. And yeah, it is out on all platforms as of right now.
Woohoo, great.
When you were discussing this, you brought up the idea of tropes and how the tropes were going to play together. When you plot out your romance novels, do you also have an overall structure that's independent of the tropes, or is it the tropes that guide the telling?
I would say that the most common plotting structure that I would use, that I think a lot of writers use, I'm certainly not this is a very like standard thing, is say in following beats kind of from like Save the Cat.
Mhm.
And so I tend to really work on those type of story beats because I write commercial fiction. And so if you're in like, if you're watching a commercial movie or reading a commercial book, like you're going to have an expectation that certain beats are going to be hit. And so I tend to structure my stories through outline form using kind of like the Save the Cat traditional beats, but then also really thinking about how trope plays into it, because I think that especially in romance, when you're picking up a romance, you have the expectation that you're going to have a happy ever after, but you've got your favorite tropes. So you might like an enemies to lovers, or you might like a grumpy sunshine. And so you're chasing like a certain experience as a reader. Romance readers, they read at a high volume, so they know what they like. And so just trying to make sure that you're kind of hitting the expectations of the trope also within the story beats.
And so the Save the Cat structure, we've been talking in the podcast about the hero's journey. I think they have some overlapping between the two of them. Are they radically different?
I can't speak to the hero's journey one, so I'm not exactly sure.
But one thing they both have is climaxes, right?
Correct. Not every story. I mean, look, most stories do. It makes sense to have one. And so if you're thinking about it from like the premise of what I'm writing, I do apologize for not being as familiar with the hero's journey, but like if you're thinking in structure, you're going to mostly have two people who start the story out like wearing masks, right? So those masks are going to be like what they're projecting to the world, covering up whatever vulnerabilities they have, whatever wounds they have, whoever they think they need to be. Then through the process of the book, they're going to fall in love, and those masks are going to drop more till where they're being more their authentic selves and they're more of their identity. That's a very vulnerable and difficult position to do. So you've got like lots of bumps along the way to get to that. And the climax is where you're going to earn that. So in a romance, you're going to earn your happy ending in the climax if you're writing it successfully, because in the climax, they're going to have to lose the mask. Like the mask has to be broken at some point. You might have had like false starts before where you like lower the mask or whatever, but at some point it's got to be like, nope, I am making a choice to make a transformation. And that's going to happen in the climax. And that's more of like an internal arc. An external arc might be like the bad guys are really all enclosed and fighting. But in a good story, I'd say you'd have like an internal climax and an external climax to be ultimately very satisfying, because you want to have plot build up to something, but you also need the characters internally to be building up to something too that they're going to overcome. So that happy ending in a romance feels earned. Otherwise, it doesn't feel as satisfying, and they just kind of like got what they wanted.
Kind of curious, just since I don't read a lot of romances.
Yeah.
Do you read any romances?
I finished Outlander. I finished the first book. I like the show better. I call it time travel porn. Anyway, so do romances like to fulfill whatever the reader's expectation is? Do they always have to end with the girl and the guy, or whoever, they and them getting together in the end? Can the climax kind of kill one of them off? I mean, do they have to, is it predictable?
No, the promise of a romance novel is that there is a guaranteed happy ever after or happy for now at the end of the story.
Oh, interesting.
It would be like if you were reading a mystery. I'm talking about this from like a commercial standpoint. If you're reading a mystery novel and at the end they just don't solve it, that's not a very satisfying mystery. Maybe if it's a literary novel and there's an unknowable mystery, sure. So I think what you're speaking about is if there's something where a character dies, like the hero dies, but there was a passion throughout. That's a love story. Love stories, I mean, like think of like Romeo and Juliet, like famous Shakespearean love stories. But a romance novel, the reader's picking it up knowing there's going to be a happy ever after, which is a unique challenge to a writer, because you have to then engage the reader when they already know that at the end, love is going to win. However, I will also argue that if you flip that too, it's also a very subversive thing, because essentially the reason I am like really proud to write them, and I think they're really important, is because when you're in the real world's not always centered for, let's say, women to win and to have everything they want and all their dreams to come true. And we're also seeing a lot more romances coming out featuring people from different like gender identities or sexualities, or, people of color. And so seeing like their joy centered, their pleasure centered, their goals, and everything's going to work out for them. That can be very subversive in our society as well. And so that's where I think there's a lot of pride that I have in writing romance. But also, yeah, you can't build something as a romance and then kill the character. At that point, you're defining it as a love story. It's not a dumb question at all. It's that, like, if you're in the romance world, you're very used to that. And if you're not going to know.
So, in terms of crafting conflict, then, if there has to be a climax and at the end of the climax they get together, are the conflicts just like different versions of them not being able to get together? Like you're kind of questioning whether they're going to make it, or is there more like leeway there? Is there more creativity there?
Yeah, of course. It just really depends on what the story is going to hold. Romance readers are very well read. They read a lot. And they know what they like. So there are some people that really just don't enjoy reading what they consider to be third act breakups, which might be in the climax, the couple breaks up. Sometimes it's going to make a lot of sense. Like sometimes the plot really needs to have that and it's going to make sense. But if you're just kind of like, I don't know what to do, let's have them have a fight and a miscommunication, they break up and then they get back together. If it's not really like well, like woven into the plot, that could be annoying. And you could see that as kind of like a writerly crutch. Is the climax more internal? Is the climax more external where they're together and they're happy and they want to be together, but like something in the world is like threatening them? It may be that the relationship itself isn't even being threatened. It could be something else. Though I would say, just because a lot of romance is fairly emotionally driven, that there's going to be something that you need to overcome in order to be like worthy of like having love.
And I was thinking, you're saying that you have a dual POV. So you've got his and her perspective, and then you have an external plot as well. And so both their masks have to come down together so they can be together after or during the climax. So you have to plot everything to all come to a single point, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, you're making it sound like I'm smarter than maybe I am. But yeah, and I mean, sometimes it's a little bit uneven. Like I would say, for example, in the book that I just wrote, Puck and Prejudice, we, I don't want to get into like heavy spoilers, but we get to a point where this is a time travel. And so do you stay? Do you go? What happens? And so my climax kind of centers around that. And so here's another thing is that like you do after the climax have that third act, right? Like I think a climax pretty much happens for the way I would consider plot books to be plotted kind of at the end of the second act. If you have a 3-act structure at the end of the second act with the third act being the resolution after the climax. And so like in this book, I would say that you've got the climax, like the big thing happens at the end of the second act. And then you've got to have the resolution where some people are going to have to make choices. Maybe the mask was still up during the climax, but, aha moments have begun that get worked out in the resolution.
Okay. So you have the climax at the critical juncture where everything turns on, but then the happily ever after doesn't happen directly after it. There are more things that might happen depending on the story.
Yeah, I would say, again, it's story dependent, but for the most part, look, I mean, I started writing just by the seat of my pants too, where I've had books that have been less successful might be like climax and then the book ends. Having that final part does kind of just like drive home whatever the theme of the story is. It lets your characters feel more believable. It lets people kind of like have that moment. And sometimes they are still actively working things out. Like in Puck and Prejudice, so you've got the whole story is kind of like building up on like that story peak. And then there's that sharp drop off to the resolution. And in the resolution, like it happens relatively briskly, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I feel like I've got like 3 chapters after the climax, essentially, maybe 4 chapters where they're kind of like working their stuff out so that hopefully by the end, it feels like it kind of is like a little bit more earned.
I will admit that I do read romance novels, and you put a lot of effort into reading this book about these 2 characters and wanting them to get together. It kind of makes sense. You'd want to have a couple of chapters of seeing them happy or seeing them together, since you put up with them being idiots for this time, and now that they're finally together, there should be some payoff.
Yeah, there's nice to have some payoff. Another technique people will do, especially if it feels like the story comes to a fairly natural end after a climax. Another thing that's popular, people do like an epilogue. Not every book has an epilogue, but epilogue is like relatively common in a romance novel. Then you get the idea of like, not only did it work in like the short term, but you can have like a longer term, flash forward as well. And people tend to like that. So an epilogue can be a good tool to have in the toolkit.
Is there anything else that you would put in the period after the climax to the end of the book? Anything you like to include?
Hmm.
Structural elements or tropes or
For me, I would say that at that point, you're kind of just driving home the point that like they're in their vulnerability, but in the vulnerability comes like strength and power. Like you're kind of your most authentic self. So trying to make sure that there's like moments or things that happen, like maybe they still have like a banter, that's fine. But like there's no more of that push pull happening. And you're kind of seeing them kind of just like healthy functioning. That's usually my goal because I think I'm in my era at the moment of writing green flag heroes, which I would say are like just good guys. So I write cishet romance. And so like, yeah, I'm going to have guys who are like, they're not threatened by their like woman succeeding, like the kind of person that's going to like, you know, not have a lot of toxic masculinity and things like that. So just being able to like be in those spaces a little bit, I feel like that's just kind of like a nice move towards the end. And so, yeah, you've had the big climax, you've had the lesson learned, but then you have to like get the reader to buy in that they've kind of like integrated whatever the lesson is. And like you said, get the payoff of like then seeing it working out and kind of getting the feels.
Is it hard to keep the story fresh? I don't want to say it's a formula because even if it was a formula to write these things and people have expectations for the certain steps that happen in these stories, once you apply it, right, it's you got to bend it to fit your will, right? You got to bend it to fit the story.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, like, is it hard to do that? I mean, do you feel restricted? Does it feel freeing having this formula? I hate to say formula, but you know what I
No,
mean?
it's okay. I don't mind it being because I feel like people like get worried, like, oh my gosh, am I insulting you by saying you're writing to a formula? I don't even know if I would use the word formula. It's just kind of like, to me, like it's like the conventions of storytelling. Like if you're watching a movie, and I'm not talking about an art house movie, just like I'm not talking about like a high literary, like, you know, novel in verse. But if you're watching, you know, what you would consider to be a commercial movie, or you're reading a commercial book, and it doesn't work as successfully, a lot of times you can go back and be like, there's something in those beats that like didn't really work. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, we just have like really internalized this. And so to me, that's not a bad thing. It's just kind of like a low grade expectation we have in how the stories are laid out. The beats honestly would apply to like a Shakespearean novel. Like it's just how we understand stories to work. What keeps it interesting and fresh to me is a mix of a couple things. So one is character, because you're just constantly putting new characters together. Generally, if you like romance or write romance, you're pretty interested in people and like what makes people tick, because like you're mining all of that to make a novel, and a romance novel, because like they're falling in love, but it's going to be like, what's their emotional baggage? That means it's not going to work out right away. Like what's happened to them? Who are they? Like, you know, what do they want? Because of that, I don't really get bored with it, because it's always just like inventing new people and putting them together and being like, what are you two all about? I really love tropes. And so I like to just get into what the tropes are, because yes, there's a familiarity in a trope, but then it's always a fun challenge to be like, how am I making it fresh? Like, how can I play with it? What can I do different? What can I do the same that like people really like? So if I'm entertained, I'm happy. And so I stay entertained with it. To me, it's fun. And that's why I write in romance. I didn't set out to write in romance. It's not the direction I thought I was ever going to go, but I feel like it's a real natural home for me.
Some romances are dual point of views, and some romances are single point of view, usually the heroine, the female lead. And so is there a different structure for the two of them? Or could you take a single person romance and just rewrite it as a dual person POV pretty easily without changing anything, do you think?
I guess I would say why would be my first question. Would be like, because to me it's like it comes to like what the story needs or wants. Like you can do either, and I think it's fine. Again, you can do first person, you can do third person. People have very strong preference. Some people only love third, some people really only love first present, first past. If you're telling it as one character's POV, I guess I'd want to be like, well, what's your reason for doing it for one character's POV? If you're doing it for two, what's your reason for doing it for two? So hopefully you just have like thought about like, what's the point? Like, why?
Mhm.
And then because of that, then I'd be like, if you've written it in first, and then you're like, well, now I want to redo it and like add him, it'd be like, well, why? And it could be like, oh, well, because I feel like the story would be deeper. I'd really like to see like things through their eyes. I can flesh out some of the story. It really just kind of depends on, to me, like why you want to do it, because it may be that there's a really good reason for it. You're like, I feel as if there's a lot of exposition that happens. If we don't see him, then he has to come and tell us everything he's been doing, and that's boring. I'd rather see it in action. Then it's like, yeah, then okay, you probably are seeing structurally that you need to have a second POV. I tend to write dual POVs just because I like to do two arcs. So I don't even think I've written a single POV. Like I'm trying to think. And no, I genuinely, I can't think of a book I've written that has had a single POV. I've only done dual POVs.
Well, definitely for your most recent book, it's such a bit of a whiplash because your male protagonist is so clearly a hockey player in the modern world,
Mhm.
and then you switch over to your female protagonist. You write in very Jane Austen style with the whole.
Yeah, there's like more vernacular that's more Regency focused. Yeah.
Was it hard to merge those two voices when they were in scenes together?
It wasn't hard to do per se. When I pitched it being like, oh, it'll be fun, two POV, she's like from the past, he's from now, la 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 la. Then I sat down to write it, and that's when I started to be like, because people who read in Regents, so again, when I'm thinking of like the traditional romance readers, because I do think about my audience when I write, you know, you get people who are like very much like, I read Regency, like not everyone, but like some people are like, I am a Regency reader. This is what I read. And so they're going to really like know like a lot of like specific terms when it comes to like clothing. You know, there's just a lot of vernacular that they're going to use that's very specific to Regency. But I'm like, if you're picking this up as like a contemporary reader, you're going to be like, I don't know what the hell this is. Like all of a sudden I started to like freak out that like, again, am I just going to make everyone dissatisfied? Because if you're a contemporary reader, you're going to be like, I feel too distanced. If you're a Regency reader, you're going to be like, this got dumbed down too much for me. And I had to really just like put it to bed in my head and be like, stop worrying about it. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and just like write my best. But I think that was pretty much how I got through it, because I can overthink and stress anything. So I just had to like basically be like, yes, this is a challenge. I don't know. Do your best. I did it execute? I don't know. I mean, like I did my best. So
One other question I had is, so having written now a time traveling person from our world going to another world, all that stuff, do you think you'll do another romance in this particular set of tropes, or do you think you're pretty much got that out of your system?
you mean for time travel?
Well, yeah, this is definitely, like you said, you're mashing two very different romance novel genres together, and you're, I don't know, are there that many other hockey Regency novel mashups?
No, I'd say that I pretty much am like corner the market on how to get Regency mashups. Hockey itself is still having very much a moment. So I've got another book set kind of in the broader world, although it is not a time travel. I just saw the cover for it, so they're going to start to like promote it soon. It'll probably not come out until, I'm guessing, the fall, but it's called The Emma Affair, or The Emma Effect. Sorry, I got my own title wrong. So The Emma Effect, again, you can see there's like a Jane Austen bent to it. So essentially I'm doing some like Jane Austen, like loose retellings or playing around with Jane Austen conventions. And so the Emma Effect has like a loose parallel to the novel Emma. There's no time travel in it, though. It is very much set in the contemporary world. And if I'm allowed, I will do like, I've got one or two other ideas up my sleeve for kind of just playing with some of the elements of like Sense and Sensibility, like playing with some of the Austen storylines, but like how to weave them into like a very, very loose retelling, like really kind of just taking like some of the core elements of the plot and having fun with it. I don't know if I see another time. I mean, I'm not opposed to another time travel, but I don't feel like it would have to just kind of be a why.
You'd have to come up with a really good title.
Yeah, I do like coming up with titles. So yeah, I like a title.
So our shtick for the podcast is we review writing advice books and we talk about the advice. Is it good? Is it not good? Or anything like that. And I was just kind of wondering, do you have a favorite writing advice craft book?
Yeah, I'll toss out one. It's got a very funny title, but I like it a lot. And it is called Seven Figure Fiction. So I cannot say I make seven figures, but I do enjoy this craft book. And the author is T. Taylor. And I can kind of give you like the bigger
Yeah.
like the 360 of why I like it. So seven figure fiction, look, I use it through a romance writer's lens. I do think that it doesn't have to be, but I feel like it works for romance quite a lot, because what it's looking at is kind of like, what is the reader looking for in your book, which is something I've been thinking about more and more. Because for me, yes, I like go away and I like respect the writer's journey, but I also want to think like, when somebody's picking up my book, what are they chasing? Like, what is the experience that they're chasing? And so what seven figure fiction kind of gets down to is essentially, when it comes to trope, they use the expression of like butter. And it's like, what's the butter that the reader wants to get? And so this is going to be kind of like, what's the emotional like experience that the reader is going to really want to have? So if we're talking about something like enemies to lovers, that's a very popular romance trope. And so what is kind of like the core butter within the enemies to lovers trope? One thing that makes enemies to lovers very powerful would be the idea that someone can see you at your absolute worst and still find you lovable. And so that's some sort of like emotional butter that the reader's going to have in this experience. Someone's going to see you just like really not being your best self. And at the same time, they're still going to find you worthy of love. But then like you could also look at this as like a Beauty and the Beast arc. Like people like why has Beauty and the Beast been so popular? Why do people still love watching the Disney movie? Why do people still write retellings of Beauty and the Beast? In that story, like, you know, being whisked away to a house where you're not doing any labor. The world around you is doing all the labor. You're not having to like do the dishes. Like the dishes are doing themselves. And so you can see there's like these like fantasy butter things that happen that really like resonate to people that are fun. Or, you know, like, I'm going to lock you up and all you're going to get to have is this magical library with everything you'll ever want to read. And it's like, oh, no, not that. And so, like, again, these are all butter things that, like, the reader is like, yes, like, this is fantasy for me. And so she kind of lays out really good examples, I think, in this book of just different elements. She uses a lot of like kind of like very popular stories, but kind of gets like, where's the emotional butter that's happening for the reader to really be like, yes, I walked away really just loving this. Like, what was it about that book that you're just like, I love it so much? And so when you're saying Outlander, Outlander is very beloved, right? It's a very popular book. It's also a very popular show series. So like, yeah, being like, there's a real butter element that's happening in this story that
Scotsman.
Scotsman, definitely.
Scotsman,
Oh my.
I would say a virgin
Yes.
Scotsman. A virgin Scotsman really had like a real star power in the first book. So yeah, there's just certain things.
Well, it's also an older woman. So I'm just like, oh, this is great. Yeah.
Yes, you've got the older woman. So you can
really
see like,
working for me.
so that's what I'm saying here is like, those are the butter things that you're putting in the book that the reader is kind of like, okay, like this is really working for me and like sticking to me. When they're picking it up, there's going to be some things that they're looking for to have that experience and they know, but then like you're really trying to think like, okay, no, this is what you want, but I'm going to like really deliver on what you're looking for.
Right.
I like that concept of butter.
Mhm.
It takes it sort of a step beyond just saying it's a trope because there's something else that's being delivered.
Like, because you were saying like with romance novels, for example, like does it ever feel like it's like the same? But it's like you could read 5 and be like 4, be like, they were fine. And then when you're like, oh my God, it was so good. And it's because whatever it is, whatever butter was in it was like your butter.
Yeah. Yeah. My butter is definitely like anti-hero.
Yeah.
Kind of refusing call stuff, very Wolverine.
Yeah.
And then contractually obligated to, you know, take off their shirt and things like that, which is great. And I don't actually read romance. I probably should. If there was some X-Men romance, I would be super into that.
X-Men were romances, except they didn't have happily ever afters.
Well, I'm sure you can just get on some X-Men fan fiction and get going because
right. I was just realizing with tropes, like we say the word trope and it's easy to assume, oh, you're just reusing stuff that's already been done, but there's nothing original, right? And like, there's a reason it's, we react to it is because it's butter, right? Like you were saying.
1,000%. And so that's where I just think that like, again, if somebody's ever feeling like apologetic or something, do you know who's amazing at tropes? And I've already name dropped them, but it's Shakespeare. Shakespeare's amazing at tropes. So think of like Taming of the Shrew, enemies to lovers, gold. But again, like I feel like we elevate stuff like that now and we make it to be like these classics of classics. They're writing to the pit of the people standing there wanting the butter experience. Yeah, just realizing that you can still try, like you don't have to feel like you're like selling out or dumbing down anything, but it's also good to remember just like there's things that just work and like they work for a reason and it's because they're like beloved. But then there's the fun thing to be like, well, what is it that like you can say about that trope? Like what is it that like you can put your characters in that's gonna say something about the trope that's fun or different or interesting? Like what's your Wolverine like angsty tortured hero going to, you know, bring to the world that's different and fun? It's fun. And as we get older, I think sometimes we like lose the ability to play a little bit. And this just puts us back in the position of playing. We're all going to get older, but we don't need to get like old, right?
Yeah.
And so this like keeps us having fun and like, yeah, being playful. I don't know. For me, that's the energy I want in 2025.
Yeah. So this has been a great interview. Before we go, can you tell us a little about just briefly tell us about your podcasts and where we can find them?
Okay, great. So I do two podcasts. So I started at the very beginning of 2021 podcasting very accidentally. I'm a writer, you're writers, like there's a lot of like online group chats. So like my friends like that I've made over time are mostly people that I talk to online. I've met them in person, but we tend to just like text each other or have group chats together. And a recommendation came through the pipeline of you should watch this show because we were all just like watching shows. It was COVID. We were like locked up. And so somebody was like, you should watch the show. It's South Korean, but it is about a South Korean like makeup heiress. And through like a series of unfortunate events, she gets stuck in North Korea and falls for like a North Korean soldier. And I was
Oh.
like, you know what? That sounds interesting. I really don't know anything about that. I'm intrigued and I got nothing to do. So like turn on Netflix. And as I was watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a full romance novel. All the beats are being hit. Like, this is fascinating. And it was like 16 episodes at the end. It's not a season. Like, they don't break them up to like carry the season on. Like, the story's done at the end of like the episodes. And so I like watched another one. I was like, oh my God, they just do like this happens. Like, there's a whole industry that's like making like romantic stories that like hit all the beats and like it's one season and like that's the story and the story's done. And yes, this is true. And so I started like analyzing the plots with my friends, just like talking through how things were structured. And after like 3 or 4, I was like, what if we just did a podcast? Because again, we're home, we're locked up, we don't have much to do. Like, let's just do these on Wednesday nights. We've put out an episode every Wednesday since the end of January 2021.
Wow.
And so it's called Afternoon of Delight. And essentially, we are billing ourselves as romance writers, exploring Korean dramas through a writer's lens. Sometimes we have shows that we just talk about tropes or we just talk about story structures. Sometimes we're like looking at a specific drama and kind of like talking it through together. It's been amazing. I've really enjoyed it. We have listeners kind of all over the world who've become, I don't know, part of like our greater community. And so that's been really fun. And the stories are never ending. So we always have things to talk about. And then the other one is I got into, so as you can see, like I never apologize for liking, I don't even call them silly. Other people would, but I like what I like. I feel like if once you're a romance writer, you just comfortable living in a world where people are like, oh, that's something. And like you might get judgment or whatever. I love BTS. They're a pop group. And from some of my podcast listeners who like listen to me like fall into BTS and get really obsessed with BTS, I started talking to them about BTS a lot and we made another podcast. And so that's called Afternoon Army. And we do like a podcast once a month where we talk about the group BTS. And like I'm traveling to South Korea with some of them in June. It's not about story though. It's just about the pop group.
For a while there, she kept saying BTS. I'm like, is that like a? I'm not sure what that is. Trying to like do the acronyms and the it's a boy band. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've had to educate Renee on boy bands.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So BTS is in the military. 5 of them, 2 of them are out. 5 will be coming out in June. And I feel like you'll hear a lot about them probably like the end of 2025, 26, because they will eventually go on a tour. It'll be like something like the Taylor Swift Eras tour. Like it'll be in the zeitgeist. So now you'll be like, oh, on this podcast, I heard about it.
Nice. I'll actually be in the know.
Yeah,
I feel like one of the cool kids. There you go.
Well, thank you. This has been really fun to talk to both of you. And yeah, I love to talk about how books get made. It's always interesting to me. I was at Christmas talking to like my husband's aunt, and she was just thinking, I don't understand how you outline something. I just think writers should be writing from the heart. And I was like, that too. It's just always interesting to me how people think the sausage gets made.
Yes.
Right. This joke applies. I've heard it in many disciplines, but when I was in grad school, I remember my professor talking about like, well, there's you know, when you're when you're a poet and you put all that effort into being a poet, right? And you're going to school to being a poet. And then later on, you meet your friend who's a neurosurgeon and they're about to retire and they're talking to you going, oh yeah, when I retire, I've been thinking about writing poetry. And then you say, well, yeah, when I retire from poetry, I'm thinking about becoming a neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
So it's
That's
kind of
actually
like,
very
oh, I
funny.
think you should write from the heart. It's like, well, have you tried writing anything?
It's always fascinating. And then like when you see people who are constantly like, well, I could do it. And you're
Yeah,
just like,
bring
then
it.
great,
Yeah,
do
let's
it. Like, and
go.
honestly, like, and I don't even mean that snarky. Like I sometimes mean it petty, but most of the time I'm like, great, do it. Because I will tell you, I've never been humbled like I was humbled the first time I tried to write a book. And I was like, holy shit, I don't even understand how to like wrangle this whole thing. I was like, my whole life, all I've done is read. And then I got there and was like, I don't know how a book, like, I don't even know how a book works.
We had a literature professor on the podcast, and she said that she learned so much when she wrote her first book that she had no idea about. And she got a PhD in this stuff.
Totally. Because once you're in the driver's seat, you just realize like you're trying to integrate so many things at once. And it's a lot you're juggling a lot of balls.
It's like watching a marionette like play and you're watching it and you're enjoying it. Oh, I know all about how their arms are moving and stuff. But then someone hands you the, what do you call them? I don't know. The things with the strings, and you're like, you tangled them up and like you've broken them, and I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah. And that to be said to anyone listening who's like aspiring to write or is trying to write and gets discouraged, is again, it's a very, very common quote to say, but I really stand by it, which is you can't edit a blank page, and half of the book gets made in editing. So you just get what you can get down, and then you sit back and look at it with those fresh eyes, and you make the book through the edits.
Well, thank you again so much for being on the show. This was great.
It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hope to
yeah,
meet both of
good
you at some
luck
point.
with your good luck with the book and with the sequels.
Okay.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga Adam. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
This might be a dumb question, so we cut it off as I could.